Created with free version for non-commercial use.
In this lesson, we will learn about the HTML element named section. So we know that the div or division element can be used as a generic container, and we know that the article element can be used for a standalone coherent piece of content. So where does the section element come into play? You can think of sections as chapters. Or in other words, we can break up an overall piece of content into smaller sections or subsections. So here's an example page, and this is the book title. This is chapter 1, this is chapter 2, and this is chapter 3. So as you might expect, if we look at the code, chapter 1, the heading and paragraph element, live within a section element. Now this section element is doing two things for us. Number one, it's creating semantic meaning or hierarchy and structure amongst our content. And number two, when we eventually learn how to add style to our page with CSS, we can target section elements, so perhaps we can add borders between the different chapters. So that is the section element in a nutshell. It's fairly straightforward, but I do want to point out that we can nest one section inside another section. So for example, here is chapter 2, and if we look at the HTML code for this area, we can see this is where chapter 2 begins, this is where it ends, and within chapter 2, there's an additional subsection, and we see that represented here in the browser. Now, the reason that I'm bringing up sections within sections or subsections is because it changes the way we view the H1 through H6 elements. Now, if we look at the headings on this example page, at least visually, it seems as though this is an H1, this is an H2, this is an H2, this is an H3, and this is an H2. But in reality, if we look at the HTML code, we can see that every heading on the page, even the heading in the subsection, is using the H1 element. So this means that when we would traditionally use the H1, H2, H3, H4 elements to create structure or a hierarchy of importance, we can alternatively rely on the section element to create that same sense of structure and hierarchy. Or in other words, an H1 heading that lives within a section is the mathematical equivalent of an H2 element that didn't live in a section. Or we can say that an H1 element that lives within a section that lives within a section is equivalent to an H3 element that doesn't live in any sections. So on and so forth. So we could theoretically create an additional section within this subsection. Example title here. Create a bit of dummy text. And we see that this new heading is equivalent to what an H4 element would look like if it wasn't in any sort of section. Now I realize this is quickly becoming quite confusing, so I will put an end to this discussion by saying that if you search the web for an answer on whether you should use sections and subsections or whether you should just use H1 through H6, you will find many different answers. Everyone has a different opinion on how you should structure your page, and I've seen excellent arguments for all different sides. I will say this. As long as you choose a method to create hierarchy amongst your content, to create organization and structure, and are consistent with that structure, I believe that you will be fine. At the end of the day, all that matters is that your content is accessible, has semantic meaning, and makes sense from a document outline perspective or a bird's eye view or a table of contents vantage point. Because again, HTML and web browsers change over time. But the art of organizing and structuring content is timeless, which is why I often use metaphors to printed books, even if that makes me sound like a dinosaur. Making sure that our content is easy to digest is very important. So I will see you in the next lesson.
Created with free version for non-commercial use.